Hi, this is Miss Lambert, and in the first part of your first guided notes for Unit 2, Miss Chandler spoke with you about the evidence that we have to lead us to the conclusions we made about early Earth's environment and the progression or evolution of life once that it formed on planet Earth. And now that she's spoken to you about that evidence, I'm going to follow up on that with part 2, which is the timeline or sequence of events of how life evolved during those early conditions on Earth as the conditions on Earth were changing. So as Earth was changing, the life forms that were able to inhabit that environment changed as well. So one of those processes always influences the other. If the Earth changes drastically, then life will evolve to adapt to those conditions. So when the first organisms arose, there was little or no oxygen in the atmosphere. The first cells then had to be anaerobic. And so this is a set of vocab words that you need to be familiar with for the quiz here and also for the rest of the year. Ana means without, aerobic means oxygen. So anaerobic is in the presence, or in this case in the absence, of oxygen. And so this is different from what we know to be true today, which is that we live in an oxygen-rich environment, and we living things breathe oxygen. But the first life forms here on Earth didn't, because there wasn't oxygen present in the atmosphere. Another set of vocab words that you need to become familiar with is prokaryote versus eukaryote. In this case, pro means before. The root kary in Latin means kernel. So in this case, they're referring to the nucleus of the cell. So to be prokaryotic means that these cells do not have a true nucleus. They get the pro added onto this word because that means that they come before the eukaryotes, which have a true nucleus. They were most likely heterotrophs, meaning that they got their energy by consuming something else. They could not make their own energy, but they had to eat something else. So hetero means different. Troph refers to the trophic levels or energy levels. So they were most likely heterotrophs that took in organic compounds for the environment. So they got the materials they needed to live from outside of their environment. They were not autotrophic. In other words, they did not make their own energy or their own organic compounds. So what happened was you had this population of heterotrophic prokaryotes that were anaerobic. They did not need oxygen. And so over time, the supply of those organic compounds that they were taking in had to dwindle. You had this population of heterotrophs that were consuming the organic compounds out of the environment. So you're going to see a shift downward in the available organic compounds that are in the environment because you have something consuming them. So at some point, we ran out of organic compounds for them to consume. And at that point, there would have been evolutionary pressure in the environment for those organisms to evolve, to adapt in a way where they were not dependent on organic compounds from the environment. And so instead of being heterotrophic, they had to evolve to be autotrophic or make their own organic compounds. The early autotrophs were most likely chemosynthetic instead of photosynthetic, where they were relying on light energy and transforming that. They were taking in carbon dioxide and using it to build organic molecules. The energy for this process comes from inorganic chemical reactions. So these reactions do not rely on carbon compounds. These prokaryotes were the only inhabitants of Earth from at least 3.5 billion years to about 2.1 billion years ago. So for about a billion years, we just had these single-celled organisms that did not have a nucleus. So they were not complex. They were simple life forms. They were in an environment that was not oxygen rich. They were taking in carbon dioxide instead, and they were forming their own organic molecules. We think that there are still some life forms present on Earth that are related to those early prokaryotes. We call these the archaebacteria because they're ancient, because they're related to these earliest life forms. So the archaebacteria thrive in extremely harsh conditions. And so these conditions they live in are extremely hot. They're sometimes associated with toxic gases. So most of the time are in an environment that is not oxygen rich. And so when you think about it, these are the conditions that are closest to what early Earth's conditions were like. But instead of it being that way all over the planet, we just have these isolated places like next to hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, or next to volcanic activity, where you find these populations of bacteria that are adapted to live in those environments. Okay, so after those first prokaryotes, the next event that happened was the evolution of cells to become photosynthetic. So some of those chemosynthetic creatures adapted in a way that allowed them to make their own organic compounds or own sugars using carbon dioxide, which was present in the environment, but also sunlight as the energy source. And when this happened, it had it says here, an enormous impact on conditions on Earth, mainly because it produced oxygen. And so you're thinking, why was this dangerous? Because it says it was a very damaging byproduct. But believe it or not, oxygen in too high of a concentration is toxic. And so what happened was you have this extreme population of these photosynthetic bacteria that are now putting out oxygen. And so eventually they gave off so much oxygen as waste that it became a toxic environment. The atmosphere was too rich in oxygen. And so oxygen then, it inhibits the action of enzymes. It can be damaging to the cells. And so what happened was it killed off a lot of the groups of organisms that were at that time living on Earth. And those that did survive are the ones that had remained in areas where there wasn't an oxygen supply, so they were still anaerobic. So those survivors, those anaerobic survivors, eventually adapted to the new oxygen-rich environment, and one of the adaptations that came about was cellular respiration, which uses oxygen. So now they're taking in oxygen and they're harvesting the energy that's in the bonds of an oxygen molecule and using it to form organic compounds or energy molecules. And the first cells that were capable of doing this were probably the ancient cyanobacteria. So they were photosynthetic. They were using the sunlight as energy. They were taking in carbon dioxide, and now at the same time they were also doing cellular respiration and taking in the oxygen to use it to break down organic compounds. And I should mention that the term cyanobacteria, cyan means blue-green, so these were the blue-green algae, and we still have groups of cyanobacteria that are present on Earth now. So you had this balancing out. You had organisms that were putting out a lot of oxygen. It caused the oxygen levels on Earth to be raised really high to a toxic level. It killed off the population that was there originally. And then the survivors adapted to use the oxygen. So over time, now the oxygen's being pulled out of the atmosphere until we eventually struck a balance where we have just the right oxygen level in the atmosphere, and we have it leveled out at today's levels. So as oxygen reached the upper atmosphere, so we're talking about the layers of the atmosphere here, and when the oxygen concentrations got to today's level, it eventually spanned the layers of the atmosphere until it was bombarded with sunlight. And so when that happens, when light energy hits oxygen molecules, which here is denoted as O2, there's two atoms of oxygen joined together, then some of those molecules split apart into single oxygen atoms, which are reactive. They then can bond with two oxygen atoms to form O3, ozone, which is a very key event in the timeline that we're discussing here of the progression of Earth, because we need the ozone layer in order to have life on land. So up to this point, we've been talking about how life evolved in aquatic environments or liquid environments. Bacteria, they need to live most of the time in a liquid environment in order to maintain homeostasis of their internal liquid. And so we don't, up until this point, we haven't had the evolution of life on land. But once the ozone layer formed, then life evolved to live on the land. And the reason why it couldn't really be there before is because if you look at this picture here, the sunlight energy can damage DNA. It can cause lysis of cells. And so UV radiation is still bad for you today. That's why you shouldn't spend too much time in a tanning bed, because it mutates your DNA and it can lead to cancer. But once the ozone layer formed, it formed this protective layer that protected life down here on the surface of the Earth to roam about here without needing the protection of the water in the ocean to kind of form that barrier between life and the sun's energy. So without the development of the ozone layer, all of life on Earth would still be in the water. We would be limited to where we could be because it would be too dangerous to spend time out in the sun all the time. It would break down our DNA. So at this point, after the formation of the ozone, now we can have creatures on land. These creatures became more complex. And so the first step into becoming more complex is inside the cell. And so the structures inside the cell began to organize into organelles, and one of the organelles that developed was the nucleus. And so once you have a nucleus in the cell, now you're talking about eukaryotic cells. U means true, so now we're true kernel cells or true nucleus cells. They're larger. The DNA is organized into individual chromosomes, which are housed inside the nucleus, and they contain those membrane-bound organelles. So you have all of this development of complexity that separates a eukaryotic cell from a prokaryotic one. So the development of eukaryotic cells took place between about 2.0 and 1.5 billion years ago. And it's kind of an interesting process how this happened. We think that originally one or two organelles that are now present in plant and animal cells, the mitochondria, and in plants, the chloroplast, we think that those might have lived independently at one time. And then at this point in Earth's history, a ancestral host cell, let's here on your figure, actually took in the mitochondria and the chloroplast, and they became organelles inside of that host cell, and that's when you had the development of a true eukaryotic cell with these organelles and a nucleus. So we call this theory the theory of endosymbiosis, and that just endo means to take in or within, and symbiosis means to live together. So now you have what once were free living structures that have become one living cell together. And it tells you that down here at the bottom that the modern mitochondria now have become very focused on their function in the cell, and they provide a cell with